Oh my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining Brandon DeCruz, myself, Jeff Black. We're joined by a guy named Danny Lennon, who I actually have never met, don't know anything about. So I get to learn just as much as you all today, which is always exciting. So there's no stranger danger. But we're going to talk today about meal timing, chrononutrition, and circadian eating. And Danny Lennon is actually with Sigma Nutrition. So Danny, I want to turn it over to you. So the guy who left us the review about saying he didn't like hearing about my and Brandon's business in the last 7 days, you don't get to hear about that shit. You just get to hear about Danny. So you got about maybe a couple minutes where Danny gets to spill it. But Danny, give us a little bit of information, man. I know it's a pleasure to meet you. Good looking chap from what I can see.
Very kind.
But Brandon said that you were the first podcaster besides Joe Rogan that he ever stumbled across. So I guess his man crush on you has been long, hard, and deep for a while. But give us
probably 300 episodes deep.
Oh, jeez,
it's been a long time coming,
all
my
right,
friend.
I'm gonna have to tune into this, and I'll start crushing on you too, Danny. Don't worry, I'll make it with your menage a trois with us at that point. But give us a little background on you, Sigma Nutrition, and everything, and then we'll get into this episode.
Yeah, sure. So to keep it brief, not to bore people, I think my background initially, from an academic standpoint, I did an undergrad in biology and physics, but my real interest was nutrition science, and I ended up doing a master's degree in nutritional science at the University College Cork, which is in Ireland. And off the back of that, I started working as a nutrition practitioner, but more of my interest was about reading and creating content. And so in early 2014, I started Sigma Nutrition. And part of that was starting the podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio. And so I think a large part of the quote unquote success of the podcast is probably a function of timing and luck. And but through that, I just consistently have had that podcast go out weekly since early 2014. And the focus has largely been on how do we get evidence-based information related to nutrition and health out there, primarily through talking to academics doing research in the area, or practitioners like dietitians or doctors, etc. So that's been a large part of the business. But in addition, I also create content in written form, or I'm lucky enough to do some presentations and so on. But I think the way I would tend to describe the work I do to people is try and bridge the gap between what's being done in academia and then practitioners who are using that. So most of our audience would be at an intermediate to advanced level of knowledge, I think, and it's to trying to get into some of those interesting details and connecting them with people who are doing that primary research, and hopefully to give some of our own interesting takes on some of those topics as well. And so that has been what I've been doing for the last period of time, and that has led me to this point. So I won't continue rambling, but I'm happy to answer any more questions that might come from that.
Yeah, I actually have a question before I turn it over to Brandon. How much do you enjoy podcasting? Is it probably your favorite or least favorite form of sharing education with potential clients and other people in the space who are looking to grow and get better?
Yeah, a great question. And that's really what led me to double down and focus on the podcast early on, was that my initial idea, I think everyone has it when they start creating content, is, oh, I'm going to do everything, right? I'm going to do a podcast, I'm going to do a YouTube channel, I'm going to write these articles. And sure, there's ways maybe to do that, but by nature, the thinner you spread yourself, you have to take away from time doing the other. And I found that it was really an overlap of two things. One, the podcast started to get some early traction because people seemed to be enjoying it, but also was the medium that I was enjoying doing the most. And I think for me right now, probably the reason why I continue to enjoy it is there's something you get from long form conversations that you just can't get in many other places, perhaps apart from long form written content, or somewhere else where you can really expand on ideas. And given now that it's well shown that people do listen to long form content, and people are more than willing to listen to hours of discussions as long as they're interesting, I think for me that has led me to continue to think, yeah, this is something suitable where I can give enough context and nuance to a point, and it is both interesting to me as well as hopefully the people listening.
Cool. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, man, because I agree. I think that there's a time and a place. Like Brandon will tell you this week, I always get in trouble on Instagram and shadow ban for just whatever reason. He goes to tag me. He's like, what do you do? And I'm like, I must have posted something that offended someone. And now I'm off social media again. So sorry. But I do really enjoy doing a podcast because people get to know you in a different way. Social media to me is like the WWE. That's like my personality that, if I were to be a wrestler, that's probably some loudmouth dude who just makes fun of like the government and everything else between is what I portray on that. But I am that way in person too. Not saying I'm not, but it's just a different persona, right? And I've really enjoyed podcasting. That's why Brandon and I linked up to do this, because we both have similar values and similar mission in what we're trying to do. So we appreciate you joining us. So B, I'm going to turn it over to you, man. And you can run the offense today like I normally do. And I will take the role of piping and asking questions of you two along the way for clarifying stuff and go from there.
Sounds like a plan, my man.
Cool, dude.
So today we wanted to have Danny Lennon on the podcast, especially me, because I've been listening to his content for so long. And I find a lot of utility and value in those that are able to have nuanced conversations, because often, like Jeff was just alluding to, when we get on social media, we're so limited by these, these word structures and these limitations that it's for an audience that's much different than the audience that we speak to on a daily or on a weekly basis within the show. And it's for those that have a shorter attention span. They just want these little tidbits and these little short, simple stories, essentially. And really, when it comes down to nutrition, when you're really trying to get more advanced with it, there are a lot of nuances that need to be considered. However, especially in today's like nutrition industry, we tend to swing from extreme to extremes in terms of going from like one end of the spectrum to another. So, in today's conversation, we're going to cover chrononutrition, but this is something that meal timing in and of itself has been highly debated for years. So at one time, when I first got into this industry, and I'm sure both of you guys can attest to this as well, it was like everyone made it seem like nutrient and meal timing were the be all end all. So it was like, the only way you were going to gain muscle or lose fat was if every single thing was timed. If you had your post-workout shake, immediately after the last set of your workout. And now we've kind of like swung into the exact, opposite end of the spectrum, where it's as though total calories are all that matters. So the timing of your nutrients and meals don't matter at all. And usually what I like to say, and we often allude to this on the podcast, is that usually the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But there's this idea that unless something is related directly to energy balance and it's only concentrating on calories, then it doesn't matter. And I feel like a lot of times within our nutrition space, because everyone's trying to get across these simple stories that people can, get in, a little caption or on, a Twitter feed, that they take this nihilistic viewpoint where many make it seem like, nothing matters except for calories, if they're accounted for. So this leads many to think that strategies like nutrient and meal timing aren't important, when in reality, they don't supersede calorie balance and macro and micronutrient composition of our diets. But dialing in the timing is something that can have an added benefit. So really, chrononutrition is something that has only become really popular or alluded to me in the last few years. I believe the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded in 2017 on the topic of chronobiology. And that's really where you start seeing a ton of more papers come out on this topic. But it's something that I've become quite fascinated in. And thankfully, Danny's put a ton of great, content out about this. So this is why I specifically reached out to you as an expert on this topic. And really, I like looking at, we do discuss energy balance and all those fundamental topics within the context of our show. We've had Eric Helms on and talking about the hierarchy of importance. But I also really like to center on the habits and behaviors around nutrition that we can implement into our lives and become healthier as a result. And because this is just like another lever we can pull. And I really look at the principles of chrononutrition as that. So we have energy balance that'll serve as a foundation, but we shouldn't just simplify it down to, as long as you hit your macros, you'll be able to optimize your body composition and metabolic health, which is why, Danny, today we wanted to have you on, discuss this in greater detail and see, what are the potential benefits that we can get and see from integrating more of these chrononutrition principles or the research that's behind it into our daily lives. And it's not that we have to take on every single thing that chrononutrition is about, but even just small implementation, small habits and behaviors that we can, apply to our lives and see how it impacts us, we can potentially see some vast and some really vast benefits from them. So, I would love for you, if you could give us a little bit of an introduction to chronobiology, like what it is, and then also what factors regulate our circadian rhythm, and especially like our central and our peripheral clocks.
Great. Yeah. So I think the simplest way as an entry point when we think of chronobiology, this big umbrella term you just mentioned, is thinking of chrono meaning time. And so we're thinking of these time-based phenomena that happen within our biology. And of course, there's many of these that we could think of that happen on a cyclical or rhythmic basis within biology. So even nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. If we think about hibernation of animals, we can think there's this time-based rhythmicity to it. If we think then for humans and some of the aspects of human health, many of the important processes or hormones in the body have this set rhythm to them. So examples being the menstrual cycle. This is something that repeats at a cyclical, on average, every 28 days, with the variation from individual to individual. But the same changes in hormones and menstruation happens continually in this rhythmic way. And so we're generally talking about these different processes that have this temporal, or what we call time-based aspect to them. Now, when we think of rhythms in the body, to get to the other phrase you mentioned there, circadian rhythms, which I think people have had some degree of awareness of or have heard about before, really there's different types of rhythms that can occur. So the one that I just mentioned, something like a menstrual cycle, where we have something that lasts more than 24 hours, we actually call this an infradian rhythm. We can have something then that's a very short rhythm, say less than 24 hours, and an example of this would be our sleep cycle. So within one, say, 7 or 8 hour block of sleep, people may have heard this is broken up into cycles of roughly about 90 minutes that continue for the duration of sleep. They would be called an ultradian rhythm. And then probably what most people have guessed now, if we have something that is about 24 hours, this is where we get circadian rhythm. And so we have many processes in the body that are tied to a circadian rhythm. And where some of the aspects we're going to get into come in is that there are many processes and hormones that would have an almost natural circadian rhythm, meaning that they would repeat at about 24 hours for each cycle, but it's not precisely 24 hours. So on average, our circadian rhythms, if we had, say, no other environmental cues, no light, etc., would run maybe a bit longer than 24 hours. For some people, it might be a bit less, but on average, it's a bit more. So it's not exactly 24 hours. So what we do to synchronize them to exactly the 24 hours of our solar day is use cues from our environment to tie them to that. Therefore, that's why the strongest time cue for our circadian rhythms is going to be light. So we call this a Zeitgeber, or this is something that essentially helps us regulate these rhythms. So light is going to be the main proponent, or the main indicator of that. But there are many others. And so this is where we get into these different clocks you mentioned. So as a brief bit of background, and we can go into more detail if you wish, but we have what's called a central clock that's located in the brain, and particularly in a part called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's the main central governor of many of these circadian rhythms. It's called our central clock. But we also have these circadian clocks that are located in tissues all around the body. We refer to these as peripheral clocks. And these can be influenced quite strongly by that central clock itself, which helps regulate them. But they can also be influenced by other environmental cues separately. So this could be activity, it could be meals or nutrients and absorption of those, which is where some of this timing comes in. And so what this field of chrononutrition really is looking at this intersection of when we consume foods, how much of them we consume at those times, those nutrients we consume, and how that interacts with these various processes, hormones, etc., that have a circadian rhythm to that. And as I'm sure we'll probably mention in due course, there's a bidirectional effect here, meaning that our eating can impact some of these rhythms, and then vice versa, the rhythms of some of these hormones can have implications for what we eat. But at a very kind of overview level, before I go on too long, just for people, chronobiology meaning related to time. We have these different cycles that happen in biology, and as it pertains to human health, we have these different types of cycles, circadian rhythms being ones that are tied to about 24 hours. And then we have many different hormones and cycles in the body that have a circadian rhythm. So for example, melatonin, cortisol, leptin all have a circadian rhythm. Our core body temperature has a circadian rhythm. Our sleep-wake cycles tend to have a circadian rhythm to them, etc. So I think that's enough initial foundation, and then maybe I'm happy to jump in on any particular points that weren't clear.
Absolutely. So really, when we speak about chrononutrition, I feel like these are looking at strategies and principles that can help us with circadian alignment, essentially, where we essentially try to align, when our central clock, so the CSN, and then our peripheral tissues or peripheral clocks are operating in alignment. Would you agree with that, Danny? We're trying to get both systems working in an operational fashion where we're looking to leverage some, say, today's conversation will really center around nutrition, but we could even look at exercise, timing, and things of that sort, and really trying to optimize when we eat with the most optimal times in alignment with our circadian rhythm.
Yeah, and so really, I think there's two useful ways for people to think about the concept of alignment. One is, as you just outlined, this alignment between the regulation of the central clock and then the peripheral clocks around the body, that their alignment, meaning that we don't have, let's say, the central clock regulating circadian rhythms at one set period of time, and then at other times we're getting the say the peripheral clocks in the intestine having a time or a feeding cue that's going to impact their rhythm locally, let's say. But probably an easier way to think of this, and another important aspect of alignment, is we want to have this endogenous circadian rhythm that our body naturally has in alignment with our behavioral cycle. So we have this endogenous circadian cycle, and then we have our behavioral cycle. And keeping them in alignment more or less is probably going to be more beneficial. So as an example, where do we get these different cycles behaviorally? Well, we go through periods of feeding and periods of fasting. We go through periods of light exposure and dark exposure. We go through periods of sleep, and we go through periods of activity. And so really, we want these to align in a certain way. In other words, as we'll probably come to, there's probably downsides to having a lot of our feeding during that darkness or nighttime biological night when we're typically supposed to be at rest. Or when we have someone doing night shift work, that's another change where there's a misalignment between the behavior, so staying awake, and then the typical circadian rhythm that would be there for our sleep-wake cycle. When someone is staying awake longer or pulling an all-nighter because they're staying up, there's going to be some degree of alignment there between that behavior and the endogenous circadian cycle, if that makes sense. So really, that's the idea of misalignment. And so the way you would induce this essentially in research is actually you can shift people's circadian cycle and purposely cause them to become misaligned. So in other words, you will shift their sleep time maybe by an hour or two each night for consecutive nights, until now those participants could be staying up during the night and then going to sleep during the day. Now we've shifted their cycles, and there's a degree of misalignment there going on. So hopefully that makes some degree of sense to people listening.
Absolutely. And since you did hit on misalignment, would you mind going over some of these health implications of, say, circadian misalignment, or what a lot of people would refer to as circadian disruption? Because there's a lot of health implications that I don't think people, realize within our society, whether they're working night shift. That's obviously a very apparent one, but even just social jet lag. So getting off kilter with your schedule, and say during the week you have a regular schedule, you go to sleep, you eat meals at certain times, but then on the weekends, you kind of shift that back. Or most people will think of jet lag in the concept of traveling across time zones and how it kind of sets off their internal rhythm. However, most people in America, or in most countries in the world, especially industrialized countries, they go through this process of going from being aligned to misaligned on almost a weekly basis. So it's almost like, just like people do with their calories, where they maybe eat in calorie balance or energy balance during the week, and then they overconsume on the weekends, they almost do the same thing with their habits and behaviors around their light exposure or even their feeding time. So we see that that gets shifted back. But we also see that in terms of their sleep schedules, where most people will Friday through Sunday go to bed a little bit later and wake up later as well. And that does have some implications from a metabolic health perspective.
Yeah, so there's a few ways to look at this. As you know, with misalignment, this can lead to, at least acutely, a lot of potential detriments. And I think the first point I want to be really clear to caveat on is when we mention these, and some of the research that's done on misalignment often is done in the context of a complete flip. So in other words, it's a 12-hour misalignment. So you go from the hours that someone is usually going to be awake to completely the opposite way around. So that would be, some of those results are obviously going to be quite significantly different if someone just has a couple of hours here or there. But if we take that, essentially we can see with some degree, or with essentially when there's a lot of misalignment, there can be probably most systems within the body get impacted in some way. I think probably where we have most of the strongest work or the most startling results tends to be in relation to things like glucose tolerance and insulin. That's one really good example. I think Frank Shear, who does work at the Chrono Lab in Harvard, has done a lot of great work in this area. And with some of their misalignment protocols, you can see that for the 12-hour misalignment, which I said is like that maximal difference you could get, it'd be like going from, say, Northern Europe to Sydney, for example, that degree of flip. You see like a complete flip rhythm of their cortisol. So it's high when it's usually low and vice versa. You see same thing, like a dampening of their leptin. You see most then pronounced is their glucose and insulin. So over the course of the day, much higher elevated glucose, higher elevated insulin, as measured by things like a postprandial glucose test. So 2 hours after a glucose dose, if you look at someone's glucose response to that feeding, you can essentially get an idea of how glucose tolerant they are. And they did a really nice job of testing people before the misalignment protocol. So they had a baseline of where people were at initially, which was all pretty much normal 2-hour postprandial glucose responses. And then after the misalignment protocol, you see a wide variety in response depending on the individual. But for some of them, there was a really startling response where I think if you look at 3 of the participants in particular of those individual data points, one of them ended up with a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test result that would indicate type 2 diabetes. Now, of course, to be clear, they don't have type 2 diabetes, but this was the result they would get, would put them in that range, so above 11 millimolars per liter. And for 2 of the other data points, they would be indicating pre-diabetes. So we're seeing this worsened glucose response with misalignment. The same thing with this elevated levels of insulin. So in other words, not going up and coming back down as we would want, kind of staying chronically elevated for a bit longer. So, and I think, and probably what will become a theme in much of the work in this area, probably things like glucose tolerance and glycemia are where we have some of the strongest or most detrimental results, and probably the most consistent results as well. So I think that would be one clear example that has important implications. And so then if, to the second part of your question, when we're trying to tie this to what people may be doing, if people are doing shift work, particularly if that's rotating shifts, that can have implications for, at least acutely at certain days, what's going to happen with their blood glucose responses to meals, insulin, etc. So I think there are a few of them, but really you could take it that if there's a significant amount of misalignment, most of the systems of the body are going to be affected negatively in some way.
No, absolutely. And it's funny that you hit on Shear's work, because I'm actually preparing a presentation. Jeff and I, we work with a group called the Excellence Cartel, which is another podcast that Jeff hosts. And we do something called the Physique Education Collective. And I'm presenting on optimizing insulin sensitivity. And I was looking at Shear's results. He had done like you mentioned, a misalignment study. And what they showed was that when subjects were aligned, the average blood glucose response was 100 milligrams per deciliter. So that would still indicate that would really be right at the edge, starting to get into prediabetes. However, when they looked at the average misalignment response in terms of postprandial blood glucose, so that was a 2-hour post-meal test essentially of their blood glucose response to their first meal of the day, so to breakfast. And this was a standardized meal. They saw that the average was 132 milligrams per deciliter, which is above that prediabetes category. And that's, a lot of people were speaking about the fact that these were pretty drastic pretty drastic interventions in terms of 12 hours of misalignment. But
Yes.
there was just recently a study on the metabolic health status of US adults based off the NHANES data set. And what that indicated was only 6.8% of Americans were considered metabolically healthy by the metabolic syndrome criteria. And really what they also showed was the statistics as of 2021. This was a 2022 study released in July. It was that 63.1 to, I believe, 66% of Americans are already pre-diabetic or could be labeled based on their blood glucose and HbA1c. So we have to also think about the fact that there's a lot of people in our society that are metabolically unhealthy. And by getting into this state where even if it's a few hours of misalignment, missing a few hours of sleep, or really getting into these disrupted patterns, like we're going to speak about obviously a lot of nutrition, but also this circadian biology applies to your sleep patterns, your light exposure, all these different entities within your behaviors and habits that impact both your body composition and then your health. So these are predisposing people to things like prediabetes, the prevalence of higher rates of the development of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and things of that sort. And we also see, just from the fact of circadian misalignment, we see that being linked to things like obesity. And this, when we say linked, it doesn't mean that it's causing it or that it's causal, but it's correlated to things like obesity, depression, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, even impaired immune system. So there's a lot of implications that could come from not paying attention to these things. And luckily, within the last couple of years, sleep and really looking at all these different interactions, like you said, the bidirectional relationship between how nutrition impacts sleep, but also how sleep impacts nutrition, has become a lot more popular to speak about. But years ago, a lot of people within nutrition would have just looked at the macros and the calorie balance, and that's all that matters. Mm-hmm. However, yes, when it comes down to, if you are, I work with some high-level bodybuilders. I have an IFBB pro stepping on stage tomorrow morning. With those individuals, they're very meticulous. They're going to track everything right down to the gram. But for the average, lifestyle client that I work with, or the person in the general population that listens to this podcast, a lot of these things are habits and behaviors, because they're not going to track everything down to the gram and really be in calorie balance. So all these little things that we could educate them on, or these habits and behaviors we can dial in, from timing their nutrition in a manner that's more optimized towards when they're more insulin sensitive, or they could be more they're at a less predisposition towards insulin resistance, such as eating at night or biological night, are little things that could be add up over time. They could give us percentage points to really optimize not only their body composition but also their metabolic health.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of expand on some of those things you said, more of Frank Shear's work is also looked at beyond things like glucose, looking at hormones like ghrelin, which we can think of as that appetite hormone. Him and Marta Garrelay have talked about ghrelin, or things like desire to eat, which you can measure in some of these studies that occur with some degree of chrono disruption, which again isn't necessarily just down to feeding timing. To be clear, this could be things like shift work, etc., social jet lag, as you mentioned earlier, jet lag itself. So there's many of these aspects, like you say, are important. The other thing that you bring up that is really important to make clear as a caveat to people is, one, with those results from some of those studies, for example, the Shear study, when we talk about those average figures, when you look at those individual data points, as I mentioned, you have some people with these drastically elevated glucose responses. For some of those people, after the misalignment protocol, their 2-hour glucose tolerance test was the exact same as before. So there's an individual component here that probably is tied to genetics, among other things. And then the second component is understanding the importance or the magnitude of effect we would see in different populations. So like you said, this might be much more important for someone who is maybe a member of the general population with some degree of insulin resistance already, who's maybe not very physically active, who is doing shift work and is maybe making already poor dietary choices. Then some of the stuff we're going to talk about later in terms of things that could make a glucose response to a meal a bit worse could be enough to become more problematic, versus someone who is doing other lifestyle behaviors more correctly, maybe is younger, maybe is very physically active, is after going to the gym for 2 hours before an evening meal. All those things are going to factor into, okay, even if there's some degree of a change, the magnitude may not be clinically meaningful for some people based on either individual genetics or some of these other factors we mentioned. So that's a useful point just to bear in mind on the meal timing, but certainly for chronodisruption generally, for example, what shift work does, I think most people will get negatively affected by things like that when you have a complete flipped circadian rhythm.
Absolutely not. I couldn't agree more, because I test fasted blood glucose with all of my clients on a weekly basis as a low barrier to entry health metric to track with them over time. And I've seen, pretty wild swings in deviations, not only from lack of sleep or sleep curtailment, essentially when they've had, a baby or when they've had a different shift, but also especially when they went to a night shift. It's a drastic deviation. And it's not to the magnitude that we saw in the shear study, but it is, if someone was averaging, say, 85 milligrams per deciliter, there's times that it's 10 to 15 milligrams per deciliter higher on average over the course of weeks. And that's where we have to look at nutritional interventions, really monitoring what they're doing in terms of during their shift, how they're eating, different timing of nutrients. And that's where we'll get into, our next topic, which is really around how does our meal and nutrient timing impact our insulin sensitivity? Because there is a large relationship between the two that I think you could extrapolate on.
Yeah, so I think for me, this comes back to the point we made earlier of looking at this in two different ways. That because we noted earlier that our meals can have this, can act as a cue on some of these peripheral clocks. So indeed, food itself can act as a way to set the rhythm in, say, some of these peripheral clocks. So it could have an effect there. But I think what we need to then also note is that the opposite is happening, that there are these processes that have these circadian rhythms that then have implications for when it may be better or worse to make certain nutrient choices. Now, by that, I mean, we know there is this circadian rhythmicity to insulin sensitivity, let's say in the muscle across the day. We know that there's this circadian rhythmicity to beta cell function. So beta cells are located in the pancreas and are involved with our insulin response. And that's why we typically see these worsened glucose responses at night versus during the day. So one of the most consistent things that you will see from this literature is that if you consume a meal, let's say that has a decent amount of carbohydrate at what we call biological night, and I can explain that in a moment. For now, let's just say in the middle of the night, someone has a meal, and you had the exact same meal during the middle of the day, there would be a different response in terms of your metabolism to lead to a different postprandial glucose response. So to be very clear, let's say you have a meal at 3 p.m. versus the exact same meal at 3 a.m. Typically, for most people, there's going to be a worsened glucose response having that meal at 3 a.m. because we have this worsened glucose tolerance essentially at biological night. Now, what we mean by biological night is not necessarily clock time, so the actual time on the clock. It depends on someone's own individual, what we call chronotype. So people may have heard some people are like early birds or night owls, and there is an element where there is a distinct chronotype that we have. More specifically, what is looking at is at nighttime, we typically see a rise in melatonin levels that help lead to the onset of sleep. And once it passes a certain threshold, we call that the dim light melatonin onset. But what we can just think of right now is that melatonin starts to increase and starts to go up towards a peak. Now, when that starts to happen, happens at different times for different people based on this concept of a different chronotype. So Brandon, for you, that might be, let's say, start to occur at 8 p.m. For me, let's say it doesn't happen until 11 p.m. Now, the implications of what is late night eating or eating at biological night is completely different. So the implications of a large carbohydrate meal at 8:30 p.m. would be different for the two of us in that situation as it is for everyone else. So that's why there's probably going to be differences here based on that chronotype. So what we mean by biological night is when melatonin has risen by a certain amount. And some of the work by Marta Garolait, who is one of the main chrono researchers here in Europe, she's based at the University of Murcia in Spain, and her group has done a really good job of talking about this idea of a timing model, where it's not just the timing of food that is the problem based on clock time. It's the timing of, or the intake of, let's say, high calories, high carbohydrate, high fat meal in conjunction with high melatonin levels. So when those two things are happening together, we have worse glucose tolerance, which is what is leading to these high blood glucose responses in people at this time. So that could be if you eat a meal during the middle of the night when your melatonin should be high, or for another reason, if someone tends to have an elevation melatonin earlier in the evening, or they do something to have like really high melatonin levels during the day, which should be extremely rare, that you would still get a glucose intolerance at that point. And so it's probably the relationship between melatonin and so elevations of melatonin and then intakes of carbohydrate where you have glucose intolerance at that time, or in other words, just a poorer ability to metabolize and digest carbohydrate, which leads to these worsened glucose responses at that time. And so I think that is, like I said, probably one of the most consistent findings we see, that if meals, particularly that are high in carbohydrate and dietary fat, are consumed during biological night, the postprandial response of blood glucose as well as free fatty acids in the bloodstream tends to be more deleterious than it would be during the day. Interestingly, and in an area that might be explored in future research, is that there may not be the same detrimental impact of protein feedings at night. And again, more work needs to be done because this is kind of based on like some mechanisms and some of the actual sports nutrition research we see, but could provide a situation where someone, let's say, who's doing night shift work could have a meal where they're consuming a large whack of protein and is not going to have these negative postprandial responses because they're having relatively low amounts of carbohydrate and fat. But that's an aside for now. But the main take-home point for people is that, yeah, we see a worsened glucose response to meals, as well as a worsened fat metabolism response to meals during biological night. And by biological night, we mean a point at which someone's melatonin has gone past a certain threshold, which will differ slightly from person to person.
Now, when I've looked into the diurnal patterns for melatonin, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, what I've seen is generally it starts to increase about 2 to 3 hours prior to someone's regular sleep time. So for me, I go to bed at 8 o'clock at night. So for me, it's 5 p.m. You know what I mean? So 5 or 6 p.m., give or take. But for other people, say that they're used to going to bed at midnight, it might be 9 p.m. And I'm not trying to tie you down to a particular timing. However, we also see that when we look at the sleep research, and now there's not too much I guess, clear-cut evidence on the best nutrition for sleep. We're talking about from a metabolic perspective, but then we also look at what are some nutrients that could cause issues in terms of negative impacts on sleep. If you look into some of the stuff that Dr. Greg Potter has put out, he usually would advise 2 to 3 hours before bed, have your last meal, stop eating within that window just to increase sleep latency. So to make sure that it's not taking an elongated period to sleep. Also, if we just think about it from a logical perspective, if you have like an distended stomach, you have a huge meal in yourself, your body's trying to digest nutrients, the likelihood of it going into a parasympathetic state and really, winding down and wanting to go to bed is going to be unlikely. Then also, when we look at it from a nutrient timing perspective for sleep, there is some research that does indicate that high fat feeding is implicated in worsened sleep quality. And so, all these things kind of align from not only a chrononutrition aspect, but also from optimizing nutrition for sleep quality, which is another part of chrononutrition or chronobiology in and of itself. But then also, like you alluded to, I know that Jordan Tromlin has done some work on pre-sleep feeding. And I think Mike Ornsby has as well down in Florida. And so that has been shown to be beneficial or to not be detrimental, not only from a metabolic health perspective, but also from a sleep quality perspective, because when they've looked at their subjective sleep ratings, they haven't been negatively impacted. So that's actually, I've leveraged that. I'm taking some of the metabolic health research, but then I'm looking at sports nutrition research and trying to utilize that with some of my athletes and some of my clients that do night shifting. But in generality, when we do look at the research, essentially, when you refer to that diurnal pattern of insulin sensitivity, we generally see it highest in the morning, and then it will slowly curtail down across the course of the day. So really, when I've looked into the chrononutrition research, besides like peri-workout nutrition, I've kind of looked at biasing more of my calories and especially carbohydrates during the early portions of the day, whatever that may be. And that doesn't mean, when I say breakfast, that doesn't mean 8 o'clock in the morning or exactly when you wake up. It's just in that early part of the day. And that's often in research, it's categorized differently. It might be before 11 a.m., like in the bath breakfast study, or it could be, 10 a.m. or just before noon, and really biasing more of that stuff. We see multiple responses. We see increase, as you mentioned, there's like 15% increase in beta cell function in the morning, 25% higher insulin sensitivity at breakfast as compared to the same meal at dinner. And then there's also the second meal effect, which I would love for you to speak on the second meal phenomenon, because that's something I've actually utilized with clients, just the knowledge around that to leverage, hey, let's get in a protein, a high protein bolus, because we know that's going to break the fast from an anabolic perspective, get you out of that catabolic position that you've just been in all night. But then also having, say, a nutrient dense, protein rich, carbohydrate containing meal also has secondary effects on your subsequent meal. So what we see is essentially when you ingest, in the biological morning, so earlier in the day, when you have a carbohydrate containing meal, it essentially leads to better glycemic responses throughout the course of the day, as far as I've seen in the research.
Yeah, there's a few points there that I think are useful to come back to. So if I forget to touch on any, just remind me. But some that came to mind as you were speaking. I think the first one that I want to make clear for people listening, because it does end up being a common question when you mention that the eating at biological night and how that's deleterious is tied to someone's own chronotype and their increase in melatonin. And people is like, well, how do I work out when I should stop eating, right? And you give this nice heuristic of, say, 2 to 3 hours before sleep. And so indeed, it is probably invasive and unnecessary for people to try and go and look at melatonin testing in their blood and so on. There's a few ways to do it. So one is there's some pretty well-validated questionnaires that people can use to assess their chronotype. One is called the Munich Chronotype Questionnaire, really well validated series of questions, and that should give people an indication of a chronotype. Even without that, probably the most simple heuristic for people is, rather than what time they typically go to bed, because a lot of time people do that on the basis of getting up for work and setting an alarm, is if you didn't have to do that and you didn't have work and you were away on a holiday, what would be naturally the time you start to feel sleepy and want to go to sleep, and then naturally the time you'd wake up? And if you got into a normal rhythm, what would be that kind of preference for your body? And that kind of gives people an indication of, okay, what would my habitual sleep time typically be? So then if we think about, well, at least theoretically, what might be a good time for that final meal, as you mentioned. And the reason why I think it's actually a really good heuristic is that it lines up with some of the work that Dr. Garrelay from University of Murcia that I mentioned has done in this area of saying, again, if we're looking at the problem potentially for some people being high amounts of glucose at the same time as high amounts of melatonin, then we can see that, okay, melatonin is going to start having that peak in that couple of hours pre-sleep. So an average, let's say 2.5 hours before the normal habitual bedtime. And by that meaning, again, what would someone's natural bedtime be based on their chronotype? About 2.5 hours, we can say it's going to start that process of elevating. And then also particularly for people who have, let's say, not constantly elevated blood glucose, after a meal, we start to see blood glucose peaks and then should start to come back down afterwards. And again, we want to see that coming back down within that 2-hour window, which is why we often use that as a test. So using that, we can now say, okay, if we're giving this time of like 2.5, 3 hours before that typical habitual bedtime, then that is allowing a period where, as melatonin starts to peak, I'm also not having this kind of peak in glucose. So that's a kind of one easy heuristic that people may want to use. But of course, if they want to take a bit further, like I said, there are questionnaires for chronotype. So that's one point I wanted to mention. The second point that you bring up around protein feeding, I think this is quite important, particularly for people listening who maybe do shift work and are thinking, look, okay, you're saying don't have high carbohydrate, high fat meals during biological night, but I'm working during night. So what's the deal here? We don't have a lot of good research that's looking at direct interventions to help people. There are some groups trying to do this, but we still need more. So for right now, we have to try and piece this together with some mechanisms. One of them is what you bring up around protein potentially could be quite useful here, because based on some of that late night feeding from Jorn Trommelen's group that you mentioned, where we see that it doesn't really impact sleep. We also have from that same group, I think Luc van Loon's lab, they did studies where they fed protein while people were asleep. So they did it intranasally with an IV, and you see that people had completely normal protein digestion throughout the night. And so this gives us some reason to suspect that, okay, if someone did have to consume food during the night, if they were going high protein, lower carb, lower fat, we're probably not going to see these deleterious postprandial or say post-meal responses. So that might be one way to go about it. And then the other way would be to keep larger meals either side of that night shift. So maybe before they go into work, so it's still nighttime, but it's not right in the middle of the night. So they could have a meal at, say, let's say if they're going to work at like 9 p.m., they could have something at 8, relatively large meal, focus on higher protein, lower carbohydrate, low fat throughout that night shift, or maybe even some periods of fasting, depending on how they tolerate it and how practical it is, because a lot of night shift work is quite stressful. And then the next morning before they are going to go to sleep, they have, again, another actual proper feeding. And that might be one strategy that hypothetically could have a benefit. But again, we need to go and test these things more rigorously. But there's enough people that are working in practice that have tried strategy like this and have noted, anecdotally at least, some benefit with clients and patients, that I think it's something worth trying. Again, with the caveat that for some people, just eating anything at all during the night is going to be probably the more realistic thing based on how some shift work is set up. So those were two important things that I think have practical utility that came up as you were talking.
No, absolutely. I appreciate you elaborating on those. That's very similar to what I've seen. You know, I'm obviously looking at research, but really the goal is to bridge the gap between research and information and then practical application. Because what my career is working as a coach full time. And so what I've really seen beneficial from my own perspective is, you know, when we look at like the protein research, we look at Jordan Tromelin's group, we look at Luke Van Loom, we look at Mike Ornsby, it's always protein shakes or, like you said, the intranasal feeding. However, you know, it doesn't have to just be protein shakes. It could be lean protein sources. I've used a lot of like protein veggie meals where you're getting that fiber benefit that's going to help with glycemic control in and of itself. It's going to help with satiety so people feel fuller rather than just taking in like a liquid protein shake, or even something like Greek yogurt has been great. Something that has some viscosity. We know that there's a lot of benefits from things with higher volumes. I've utilized other things like, you know, maybe Greek yogurt with some blueberries or with some fruit, which is going to have the benefit of fiber. It's going to have a satiety response to all these things. So we're getting higher volumes, maybe a big salad with chicken, something to help with not only, you know, we want to optimize their body composition. We want to keep calories in check, but we also want to make sure that they're satiated and not just drinking protein shakes and feeling like they're really restricting themselves. And I have tried with a very few clients trying to maybe elongate like a little bit of a fasting period, but just for many, it hasn't been realistic. And really when it comes down to the end of the day, it's really about consistency, adherence, and ability to stick with that program. So I would love if, you know, I'm sure that it's very hard to do interventions on these type of individuals. And so I would love, you know, the research continues to come out, and I'm sure it will, especially as this area of the literature continues to evolve, especially in terms of chronobiology, chrononutrition, and things of that sort. But another area I would love you to touch on, this is something like a hobby horse of mine, is looking at how chrononutrition or nutrition in general, but we're going to specifically focus on chrononutrition, how it could potentially impact energy expenditure. What I mean by that is, let's look at it from a total daily energy expenditure and really focus in on not only how it can impact physical activity, as well as the thermic effect of feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis, because I know that there's a good amount of literature and there continues to come out with more and more that looks at these two entities, physical activity a little bit less. However, diet-induced thermogenesis, there have been multiple studies that have looked at how feeding earlier in the day can have a different thermic effect for the same amount of calories in the same meal as compared to at biological night.
Yeah, so this is a super interesting one, and one actually where my view has changed on this considerably in the last couple of years, over the course of since maybe doing a lot of the writing and presenting on this topic. And much of that, I've been lucky to be privy to some of the work done by my regular co-host in the podcast, Alan Flanagan, who his PhD work was in the area of chrononutrition and was at one of the main chrono labs in the UK at the University of Surrey, who are closely affiliated with one of the also big chrono labs at the University of Aberdeen, which is based in Scotland. And some of their recent work has really changed, I think, a lot of how we should view this area of literature. So hopefully this be something of a kind of hot take that's maybe not as much out there right now. So you're right that initially there was a lot of potential promise for the potential for feeding more calorie or having like bigger calories earlier in the day, or certainly when we time meals earlier in the day, there's a greater energy expenditure response. And so this came initially from associations that we were seeing that when you have people push calories to earlier in the day, that there was, in some studies, increased weight loss in those groups. Now, those trials were not controlling for calories per se and matching it, but they were just seeing when we put more calories early in the day versus later, people are getting a weight loss benefit. So to explain this, we are left with a couple of different possibilities. One would be that something is happening where those people are just eating less. So for whatever reason, when we get them to focus more on these larger meals early in the day, they end up eating less. So that's one potential. Then the other hypothesis was, well, what about situations where it's causing an increase in someone's energy expenditure? So now, even for the same level of calorie intake, if they're now burning more calories, that would explain why they're getting more fat loss. And so some of the work then started showing that maybe there was something to this. And I think in particular, as you know, some studies showed really remarkable results in relation to diet-induced thermogenesis, or sometimes called a thermic effect of feeding, which is simply the energy we expend or burn in digesting a meal. So if there's this enhanced response from eating earlier in the day versus later, then potentially we could think, could this add up to be something significant over time? That was the idea. And I think two papers in particular showed something that generated a lot of interest. One was a paper by Morris and colleagues, which showed that eating a meal in the morning versus in the evening had a 44% increase in diet-induced thermogenesis afterwards. Now, when you look at that on what the actual calorie numbers were and the calories per minute, it's actually relatively small, but it was still there, right? It was still a number of calories difference that they reported. Then after that, there was a study out of Germany, I think, by Richter and colleagues that showed an even bigger increase, where you have a 2.5 times increase in diet-induced thermogenesis early in the day versus later in the day. So that led to people, well, this is what's causing it, right? We're getting an increase in energy expenditure through eating more calories early in the day, and that's what's driving these changes in weight loss. But as I mentioned, some of the work that's been done at the University of Aberdeen, in conjunction with some of their studies with the University of Surrey, one of which was only recently published within the last month, I think, part of a larger project called the Big Breakfast Study. That was the name of their grant. One of the first publications to come out of that came from last month. The main author on that is Leonie Ruddock-Collins, working in conjunction with Alexandra Johnston, who's another expert in this area. And essentially, they also have looked at this distribution over time. And we'll come back to that particular paper a bit later on for some other interesting things. But the same group's work, so particularly Leonie Ruddock-Collins, and one of the papers that actually Alan published with her, was interesting in that they suspected that this increase in energy expenditure after these earlier meals that were reported in like the Morris paper and the Richter paper may actually not be down to an increase in diet-induced thermogenesis because of the meal itself, that it was actually more of a mathematical error. So by that, what they meant was, and again, apologies for people who aren't interested in like the sciencey methodology side of this, but to keep it simple, what was essentially happening in some of those papers is to measure this thermic effect of feeding, or this diet-induced thermogenesis, so this how many calories we're burning to digest that meal. They did a pre-meal test of people's resting metabolic rate. So they did that before they had the meal, and then after the meal, they would measure it again. And then that difference they could put down to this increased energy expenditure due to that thermic effect of feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis. Now, one of the things that's a problem with that Leonie Ruddock-Collins pointed out, because her area of expertise is in energy expenditure, is that if you're comparing two meals at different times of the day, there is actually a diurnal variation to resting metabolic rate or energy expenditure naturally anyway. So if you're getting your pre-meal test in those conditions at two different times of the day, that could potentially be a problem, right? And the reason why that is a problem, let's say what's happening is, if you typically have a lower energy expenditure, say per minute, as you get later in the day, and now for the evening meal, you've done your pre-test before that evening meal, and then afterwards, and you don't see as much of a difference, that might not be down to actually the change. It's down to the baseline levels measured of those two meals are different. Hopefully that makes sense to people. But there was also a secondary problem, is that if you do that pre-test meal early in the day, someone is in a fasted state before that first meal, right? You measure that resting metabolic rate, and then afterwards you do their pre-test or their post meal test for that meal. Now, when you go to the evening meal and you're doing your pre-test meal, they're not really in a fasted state, right? Sure, they haven't eaten in a few hours, but because we know how long the postprandial response to a meal is, like many, many hours throughout the day, if it's been like 5 hours or 4 hours since your previous meal, because you've been eating, you're not in a true fasted state in the same way you would be in the morning after an overnight fast. And so again, that's throwing off this baseline measure. And so what they did was some really nice modeling of when you account for these two things, the natural circadian rhythm of energy expenditure, as well as accounting for this difference in pre and post test down to time of day, that essentially gets rid of any of this variation. So, in other words, I mean, it explains all of that variation. In other words, any difference we're seeing in energy expenditure from the early meal and the later meal is not down to a kind of particular timing effect per se. It's just down to what we would expect because of the endogenous circadian rhythm. So that has been quite interesting to see. And I think that has changed not only how we should view those previous results, but probably is going to change how much of that research going forward is done in terms of how we account for thermic effective feeding or diet-induced thermogenesis. And how that ties into this more recent trial, this big breakfast study trial that I mentioned, which was a human study where they were looking at a larger breakfast and a smaller dinner versus the opposite way around. And that made some headlines, again, because people kind of jumped to maybe a reductionist conclusion of, oh, there was no difference in weight loss, so it doesn't really matter. And I think that was a silly conclusion because there's lots of interesting things in the study that we might get to. But indeed, what that study did show is it was a really tightly controlled study. So they controlled people's calories and macronutrients. And when they did that, depending on whether they had this kind of bigger breakfast or not, we didn't see any differences in weight loss between those two conditions. Which again was probably what we should expect, right? Because we're controlling calories and macronutrients. So that goes to show that I think a lot of the early promise that the timing is going to have any significant degree of impact on energy expenditure through changing thermic effective feeding probably wasn't warranted, or at least has been shown now that probably isn't really meaningful and isn't there really at all. So something we can kind of push to the side, and is probably one of the things that I've changed my mind most on, or at least it was something that I'd highlighted previously. There's something to this, maybe. Now we can see actually there's probably not. But what that study did show, and I think is what probably most people missed from trying to interpret that study I just mentioned, is that even though there was no differences in body weight or body composition from that condition, there was significant differences in people's hunger and appetite ratings. So if people were having more of the bulk for like a big breakfast as opposed to a big dinner, those people had much less hunger throughout the day and much better satiety. So because, remember, this study controlled people's calories and macronutrients, if we were now to think, okay, if we were to go out into the general population where we're not controlling calories and macronutrients, it's probably better to maybe go with a setup for someone's diet that would probably lead to more satiety and less hunger. And at least based on some of these findings, on average, there could be some benefit to an earlier distribution of calories, meaning that more of the calories coming in the earlier part of the day as opposed to towards the end of the day. So I think that's an important finding from that. But specifically on the energy expenditure issue, I think we can see now that there's probably nothing super meaningful to boosting up energy expenditure from the time of the meal.
Very interesting. All right, I think you just you changed my mind on this, because I've seen this research for quite a long time, and this has been something that I've been interested in. But I was unaware of that study, so I'm definitely going to be diving into it. Is it open access? Do you know?
Yes, it should be, and it's so the Big Breakfast study is out now. There was also a previous study that I'll send you that that group did that was specifically talking about the modeling they did to account for TEF. So there are two separate papers. I can send you those and you can put them in the show notes if people are interested. And then we also have an upcoming podcast ourselves where Alan is going to kind of walk through some of this data, because he was kind of privy to some of the inner workings of some of those studies. So I can give you kind of links to those different resources for your own reading, and then for anyone else who's interested. Yeah.
No, I would love that. But now this kind of leads me into a different aspect, because, all right, now we've seen through research, a lot of times research doesn't prove something. It often disproves something, or kind of puts evidence against something that we previously believed. And I'm always open to, having my mind changed, and always open to new literature, and always, evolving my mindset or my education or the way I approach things. However, there has been other research in a different aspect where we look at the timing or the meal consistency. So the benefit of having a consistent eating schedule, and there have shown vast benefits, both in terms of glycemic response, but also in terms of the thermic effect of feeding when looking at people that are utilizing. So these are crossover studies. I believe Al Hussein has done 2 of them over the years. And just one was recent in 2022. We covered it on the podcast, where they've looked at what was considered a regular eating schedule. So say 6 meals per day, or 3 meals and 3 snacks, as compared to an erratic eating schedule, which a lot of people do. They're timing things differently. They're eating things on the run. They're going from, say, 3 meals a day one day, and then they have extra time. They're eating 6 times a day. And we have seen things like vastly different impacts on postprandial glucose response. So when someone has had a more consistent feeding schedule, they've had better post-meal glucose responses. But also in Al Hussein's, and I hope I'm saying that researcher's last name right. I'm trying to remember it off the top of my head, but I believe he or she did an additional study this past year where they looked at how it impacted the thermic effect of feeding from what was considered a regular eating schedule and then an erratic eating schedule. Would you be able to extrapolate a little bit more on that? Because now that we're looking at independently diet-induced thermogenesis from one meal in the morning compared to at night, not a big difference. It's more of a measurement error that was shown in the literature. But how about when it comes to consistency? Is there still a benefit to a consistent meal pattern, both in terms of the glucose response that we have to meals when eating, at a normal meal timing and meal schedule, as well as, a better thermic effect from those meals?
Yes. So the researcher mentioned, Maha Al Hussein, I think is out of Ian McDonald's group. And I'm familiar with the older paper that you mentioned on the postprandial glucose responses and the regular versus erratic feeding. I think it might have been 2016, 2017, around that time. I'm not familiar with the 2022 paper, so I can't comment on that, unfortunately. But on the general point that in relation to his previous study looking at the 3 meals and 3 snacks every day versus the erratic eating, indeed, you're correct that you see these worsened postprandial glucose responses in that erratic eating condition. So just for people to note, what they did was, over that course of those 2 weeks, one group was having the 3 meals, 3 snacks every day at the same time. The other group was then eating between 3 and 9 meals, but with the number changing every single day. So it could be 3, then 7, then 5, then 9, and so on across the 2 weeks. And with that more erratic pattern, you see a worse postprandial glucose response. And I think this ties into some of the aspects you actually mentioned earlier, relating to things like social jet lag, which is this term we have from Till Ronenberg, that relates to how the behaviors that we have can have these impacts that lead to jet lag-like symptoms. So the most common example typically given is people staying up later at the weekends, getting out of bed later as well, and then Monday rolls around and then having to flip back. And so we're getting these phase shifts in the same way we would be from crossing time zones. And so there's potentially something here the same, that there's an expectancy effect, almost, some people have hypothesized, of when we have these set meal times, that is potentially useful for the body, that's leading to these better glucose responses rather than more erratic eating, and particularly when the times are quite varied. So I think based on that older research, that fits in quite well with at least some of the associational work we have. I think there's some work by Gil and Panda from earlier on before that, where we saw, again, erratic eating patterns associated with worse outcomes. Again, they weren't controlled trials. That was more just
that was a smartphone app, correct? That was the smartphone app. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you had before that they had a smartphone app intervention, and then before that they had a larger group that did associational work with that smartphone app. So that was really cool. That kind of mirrors maybe some of the results from Al Hussein's earlier study, but I'm unfortunately not aware of the 2022 study. So it'd be interesting to see what methods they were using out with thermic effective feeding and kind of how that tallies up with some of what we just mentioned. But yeah, that'd be, I think there is overall a pretty good basis that I would be pretty comfortable saying to people that there's likely a benefit to consistency with meal timing versus more kind of erratic eating. Both for maybe some of these physiological reasons, but also there's a lot of practical utility that most coaches could probably talk to people about. But beyond that, I think, yeah, there is some potential utility to that. And so I think that's a pretty decent recommendation for most people to take account of.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate that. So I'm definitely going to send you the Al Hussein study so you can check it out, because I believe it was something pretty substantial, like 25 or 27% increased thermic effective feeding. How much does that impact us on a daily basis? We don't know, but I know Menno had a pretty hot take on it in terms of what that would add up to over the course of weeks, months, years. But that's obviously not something we're going to see in the real world. However, the last thing, we've covered a ton of things on the topics of how nutrition interacts with chronobiology, how to optimize these things, but also, we're really looking from a metabolic health perspective. And these are habitual things. These are habits and behaviors that people can merely integrate into their lifestyle when it's convenient for them, when they could stick to it, and it could potentially benefit them. So for instance, portioning or partitioning more of your calories earlier in the day, just to benefit, take some of those benefits from a glycemic response perspective, an insulin sensitivity perspective, nutrient partitioning perspective. But also, we should also consider, a lot of our audience is also really active individuals. So I also don't want to catastrophize. We often speak about nutrient timing from a sports nutrition perspective. So I'd love if you could cover some of the exercise and chrononutrition relationship aspects, because yes, we do see that for someone that's more sedentary, or for someone that is more predisposed to insulin resistance, that these are going to have a lot of benefits. But also, say that someone, I work with plenty of clients where they sometimes look into literature. They're really big into evidence-based practice, and they'll say, well, what should I do? Should I skip carbohydrates post-workout? Or, I'm going to be eating them at 8, 9 o'clock at night, but they just had a workout. So, we have to think about GLUT4 translocation and all these benefits that exercise can essentially buffer or mitigate some of these detrimental effects of eating at biological night. So if you could go into that, just to tie it all around and tie it up into a bow, so that people realize that this is nothing like, it's no ends of the spectrum. This is like, do what you can, take these principles. Like I personally will eat in a 12-hour window. I just find that to be best from, a scheduling perspective, but also from a digestive perspective. I monitor my blood glucose on a daily basis, and I just don't eat at biological night for me. However, if I'm going to train in the evening on a certain occasion, it's not like if I have to break that 12-hour window that I'm not going to eat, or I'm not going to have carbohydrates in the evening because I'm scared about a glycemic response, or a poor glycemic response, because I realize the benefits that just training and just having, a hard anaerobic workout in terms of resistance training can have on insulin sensitivity.
Yeah, so there's a few things I would say. First, I think, again, when people hear some of the information in this area, like you said, it's not to catastrophize this, of this is the thing I need to worry about all the time. The real big takeaways are that based on our current evidence, it probably seems likely that there is a benefit to avoiding large meals, so meaning high in calories, carbohydrate, and fat during biological night, certainly. So that's, again, late night, close to when your habitual sleep time is, and then going into the night, you're going to get a worsened response to those meals. And so, again, not that you can never do that. Again, if you're out at a party, enjoy it. But in general, there's probably some benefit to doing that. Second, we said there's probably some benefit to having some consistency in your meal times. Again, this is not to be neurotic and have to eat at the same hour on the dot every single day, but roughly that their structure of like how many meals and roughly when in the day you're having them from day to day, by and large, can be relatively similar. There's probably some benefit to that. And then there potentially could be a benefit here to, like you say, just pushing a bit more of your calories to the earlier part of the day. So again, just meaning that right close to that time where we're getting towards biological night, so final end of the day, we don't want to have a large amount of our calories in general saved up to be consuming then. There's probably some benefit to at least trying to push some of them earlier in the day. And I think those things become relatively simple to do. And then how far someone wants to take them is up to them. How much of an impact some of those things have, again, we mentioned earlier that this comes down to someone's kind of baseline. If someone's really trying to manage their blood glucose right now, then they probably want to try and do a bit more than maybe someone else, because they're really trying to do everything they can, throw everything, any tactic they can that could possibly make a small benefit at it. Whereas for people who have a really healthy blood glucose response to meals typically now, then even when we do get these elevations in blood glucose, it might be able to come back down completely normally anyway. So this is where it comes into people who are maybe very active, who are doing maybe a lot of training, particularly things like resistance training. There is a lot more leeway. So one, in general, you tend to have a healthier baseline population. Not everyone there is going to have good insulin sensitivity, but in general, compared to the average population, you have a healthier population. Second, then we know things like doing exercise and in particular resistance training leads to this GLUT4 translocation that you mentioned, which, if people haven't heard of this, the GLUT4 is a type of glucose transporter that sits in a muscle cell. And when there is muscle contraction, that transporter will move to the surface of the cell, and it allows the muscle cell to take up glucose without the help of insulin. So insulin is one of the main ways we move glucose from the blood into cells. That's why it's important at that time to be insulin sensitive. But we can have this movement of glucose into these cells without the help of insulin in this insulin independent manner, which is this movement of these GLUT4 transporters that can happen after muscle contraction. And so feasibly, we can have a situation where if someone has been lifting weights and the few hours after that, we can have pretty good glucose disposal, even if it is late at night, or even for people who are insulin resistant. That's one of the great things about resistance training, that we can have the ability to take up more glucose more effectively in that period of time after training. So that gives even less reason for those to be worried. And then finally, on a practical thing, it comes down to people's priorities. So if you are an athlete and that is your kind of main priority right now, then do those things that we know from a sports nutrition perspective are going to help you recover and fuel your performance the best. So if you are a pro MMA fighter and you have 2 sessions a day that are really taxing, and you come home after your evening training session and tomorrow morning you've got a big sparring session coming up, you don't want to say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to have too many carbohydrates now just in case I have a worse postprandial glucose response. Number one, you probably won't. And then second, your priority now is just getting glucose back in your system and restoring some glycogen, and because that is the priority. So again, none of this should throw out some of those core aspects of sports nutrition, particularly for people that are operating at a high level. So all of these individual factors should be taken into account. And there's many caveats to some of the things that we have said, one of them being resistance training and athletes more generally. But we could also similarly talk about things like social situations in the same vein. So there are caveats to what we've said, but I think by and large, there are some useful heuristics that we could maybe go with.
Absolutely. So, Danny, just to tie it all up, if you were to give our audience some practical applications, just 1,000-foot view on chrononutrition, some of the advice that you would have to, maybe improve their insulin sensitivity, improve their metabolic health, and things of that sort. What things do you think are, say, the big rocks of chrononutrition that could be beneficial if someone has, energy balance, macronutrient, composition, and micronutrient intake dialed in? Because those are always going to be the fundamental. None of this is, chrononutrition isn't going to supersede, our nutrient, our meal timing does not supersede the laws of thermodynamics. However, a lot of people, especially listeners of the show, they have these things nailed in and they're looking for that extra 5 to 10% per se, or whatever magical percent this might give. And what, advice would you give? Or you worked, pretty extensively in practice of your own for a long time as a coach. So what interventions would you utilize, not only from a nutrition perspective, but chronobiology or chrononutrition in general? So that could include nutrition, sleep, light exposure, things of that sort.
Great. Yeah. So I think we can't talk about circadian rhythms and circadian alignment without first coming to light and dark exposure, like you mentioned. I think that would be where I would start and say to people that the simplest heuristics I'll try and keep for this set of recommendations. So the simplest thing is that in the early part of the day, try and get some daylight exposure if possible. So we know that the light intensity outside, even on a relatively overcast day, is multiple fold higher than any indoor lighting you can get. And so it's important to set those circadian rhythms in the body, to tie it, to use the cue of light to set those rhythms to match our internal circadian rhythm, that we want to get light exposure early on in the day. So again, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to rush out of bed to do this. At the early part of the day, if you can get some daylight exposure, and if not possible, some people use things like light boxes and so on, if they are in particular places where they're not going to be able to do that. But light exposure in the early part of the day, and then in that kind of period just before sleep, as they've probably heard ad nauseum, avoiding maybe a lot of stimulating light. So this could either be through choosing to do things like reading as opposed to be watching movies on a tablet as they're lying in bed, or just avoiding a lot of bright lights that contain these blue and green wavelengths is probably useful, as well as just avoiding things that are very stimulating generally. So I think those would be a couple of aspects from a light dark exposure. On the nutrition front, I think we've just capped off on the main things, but I would say we want to avoid eating significant meals during biological night. So most people can think of this probably after midnight and during those kind of middle of the night hours. Certainly want to try and avoid eating there if we can. Again, it's not going to be possible for everyone, but as much as possible. We want to probably avoid large meals that have a lot of carbohydrate and or fat close to that habitual sleep time, or more accurately close to our dim light melatonin onset. And again, we use that general heuristic of maybe 2 to 3 hours before that habitual bedtime, leaving that time free of having those large carbohydrate fat-based meals. So even if someone does like having something so they're not sleeping on an empty stomach, some people do have that preference, that could be where they turn to some of those high protein snacks you mentioned earlier, where they can still do that. They're not going to bed hungry, but they've also not had a large amount of their calories in that few hours before sleep. I think biasing more calories to the earlier part of the day might be useful if some people haven't tried it, particularly if they've got into the habit of saving up lots of their calories throughout the day and then having like these like large meals right before sleep. It might be useful to try something else. We said have a consistent meal frequency and timing is probably some degree of use. And then there might be some benefit to having a kind of shortened window, although my sense right now is that much of the benefit that people are getting from reducing the length of their feeding window across the day is simply that they're actually just biasing more of their calories to early in the day by default, right? So if you give yourself a 12-hour window instead of 16, which most people do, you probably eat a bit less in those few hours before sleep and you're just pushing it earlier. So I suspect that's probably where a lot of the benefit to these feeding windows is happening, as opposed to a set number of hours being the best window to have. So I think they would be the main things on a circadian front. And then obviously that is paired with all the typical sleep advice people may have heard on previous podcasts, but typically good sleep hygiene. Try as best as possible to have pretty regular sleep wake times that are relatively consistent, and then all the other stuff that is tied to like just good sleep habits generally. And I think those in combination would make a big enough difference, and then people can explore themselves if they want to go into any of the other little details.
Absolutely. No, I really like that you hit on not only biasing more of your calories earlier in the day, but also the whole aspect of you really saving calories for the end of the day. Because we see this across multiple types of nutritional approaches, whether it was John Kiefer's carb backloading, whether it be intermittent fasting, like the lean gains approach, where they really would bias a lot of their calories towards the end of the night, or just like the average person, where they eat light during the day and then they're ravenously hungry. So they not only save a lot of their proportion of calories for the evening, but they also overeat. And then I feel like also to just go in conjunction with that, if we really think about it, to go back to that point, no one binge eats at 8 o'clock in the morning, but where we see the prevalence, even in surveys on binge eating, is at night. And it often, I always think, and even when I look at chrononutrition research, when we look at like their ghrelin scores, where they bias more of their calories earlier in the day, they have lower ghrelin, so lower hunger hormone throughout the course of the rest of the day, even when eating a light dinner. Whereas in other situations, if you are to eat really light during the course of the day, you're going to have higher ghrelin levels throughout the course of the day. That might lead you to just be habitually more likely to overeat at night. And then also just taking and curtailing that window is great just from a habit perspective, because a lot of, what we end up eating in the few hours before bed are discretionary calories. So it's a piece of chocolate or these bites or these licks, tastes, handfuls of things that most people don't track first and foremost, but they do increase our total energy intake and usually put people in a surplus. And generally we see, even in correlational studies and observational studies, that those that eat a higher proportion of their calories at night have a higher BMI, higher predisposition towards obesity. And it's not that eating at night makes you fat. So it's not, you can't eat carbs past 6. It's just, these are habitual things. So if you get in the habit where you're less mindful, both from a nutritional tracking perspective, but also from a habitual perspective, where you're just grabbing things and you're looking to the nighttime as a time to cope with food rather than, really focusing on rest, relaxation, really winding down for the day, just these little heuristics, like you mentioned, could be really beneficial from a nutrition perspective, a habit perspective, and then, a body composition and health perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think most of the literature on average tends to support the idea that if you have people who aren't tracking calories and you have them say don't eat for early part of the day or save more of their calories to late in the day, they end up over consuming relative to the opposite way around. If you have a large breakfast, let's say, you tend up eating lighter later in the day. And that also matches up with the work, like you say, on actual markers like ghrelin, but then also subjective markers, like just getting people to rate their hunger levels throughout the day. And then it's also matched up by this new study from out of the big breakfast study that we mentioned earlier, where when you match for calories and macronutrients, when you front load people's calories to a big breakfast, you see lower hunger throughout the day. And so these could be things that are important. And I think one of the common things people say is, oh, I wouldn't be able to do that because at night I'm always hungry. That's why I like having this big feed. It's like, yes, but you're used to having large feeds at night and not eating early in the day. Of course, you're going to be very hungry.
And ghrelin gets entrained through our habits.
And I think there's going to be like an adaptation that if people just did that for a bit, I think not everyone, because there's always going to be some individual variation, but I think a decent number of people could see that having a bit more of those calories earlier in the day could probably help them better manage some hunger, particularly if they don't want to track things and they want to eat more of an ad libitum, more kind of intuitive style eating. That's probably where I think on average most of the evidence would say is a pretty good shout if you're going to pick morning loaded or evening loaded.
Absolutely. Jeff, did you have any questions for our guy?
Dude, the way that flowed was perfect, because I was sitting here like taking like little notes and stuff, and I was like, I can't tie. So that's obvious, the veteran podcaster coming out there understanding the loose ends part, because you get people on the podcast who just they'll start dinging all over the place. And I know because I host the Excellence Cartel, it's a lot of like reining people in, but today's went really well. But I want to ask Danny, where can people follow you at, engage with you? How can they listen to your podcast, things like that? And love to audience, if you guys have any questions, love to have him back on for maybe a Q&A, because there was really a lot to it. And sometimes the questions you need clarification on, a lot of other people have those same questions.
Awesome. Yeah. And thanks for the opportunity. So I think if people are interested in listening to the podcast, it's called Sigma Nutrition Radio. They can just put that into any podcast app. It should come up. And like I said, we get into like pretty detailed discussions, mainly around nutrition science. And so if people are liking some of the stuff we talked about today, they can go and check that out. The website is sigmanutrition.com. So in addition to the podcast, we have a lot of written content there if people want to check that out. And then on social media, I'm on Twitter and I'm on Instagram. So Danny Lennon _Sigma on Instagram and Nutrition Danny on Twitter. I'm not super active on either of those. I'm there, so you can message me, but don't expect multiple posts every day. I'm not very good at doing that. So, but yeah, feel free to follow me in all those places and either message me there or send me an email if you have any questions, or like Jeff said, send the questions into the guys. And if they're interested in having me back, I'd be happy to do it. So any of those places is good.
I've been around this block for a while podcasting, and I can say that as from top to bottom, it was probably the most put together podcast episode, because normally I'm a loose end tire up guy, as B knows. That's what I usually bring to the table, and I had no loose ends to tie up. So it was great podcast, Danny, and I learned a lot, and I really appreciate you coming on, because a lot of questions that people struggle with is the late night stuff that we wrapped up at the end, but understanding the whole big picture of how you get there is important. So thank you for that, man.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me. And if I'd known that, I would have purposely left a few loose ends around the place.
No, it works out great.
Make me sense too.
No. But look, dudes, I'm gonna release this podcast will release the week between Christmas and New Year's. So Danny will be sure to tag the shit out of you and let you know it's out and so forth.
Awesome.
And again, thank you for your time for joining us, dude.
Not at all. Yeah, thanks for asking me. It's an honor. So hopefully I did a good enough job and it was coherent enough for people listening. So
100%.
We'll soon see.
All right, dude. Well, take care, man.
Guys, have a great rest of your day.
Bye, guys. You too.